Hi, I'm John Beauchamp and welcome to Holistic Podcasts. We often try to escape noise and strive for quieter places, where we can think, relax, be at one with nature. But we very often realize that the silence we seek is not in fact silence at all. Hi, I'm John Beauchamp and welcome to Holistic Podcasts. And in this episode, I'll be speaking to Dr Marta Michalska, a researcher on sonic history, on how we perceive sound and how our quest for silence is in fact futile. All that and more coming up in this episode, so do stay with us.
Hi, I'm Marta Michalska. I like sounds so much that I wrote a book about them, a PhD, specifically about historical sounds in Warsaw in late 19th, early 20th century. I'm also a writer, translator. Right now I work at the Center of Community Archives, so that's it.
Very cool. And it's great to have you in the studio here and have you for this holistic podcast. Let's begin with a scene. I'm taking a tram in Warsaw. It's a pretty cold day, but during the night there was a whole massive snowfall. And as a result, when I went on the balcony in the night, I could really hear that the snow is kind of muting the sound almost. And I basically wanted to start off with a picture which tries to kind of make you imagine that nature is also capable of kind of diminishing sound, also increasing it, right? I mean, when you think about sound, are there any specific sounds which work with our well-being or alter our well-being? Are there any frequencies which are known which alter our kind of state of well-being?
Absolutely. First of all, I need to say that it's a very romantic vision, very romantic scene, because we like to imagine this like on a postcard, right? With the capes of snow hanging from the trees. The question is how this vision is being still in use regarding the climate crisis thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, do we even have snow in cities anymore? But yes, this is the moment where things are getting like muted and we kind of stop for a moment. But coming back to the actual question, I would say that all sounds have an effect on the well-being, and it's just such a complex topic because
well, we have to start
yes.
somewhere, right? Yeah.
Yes. Because sound in general has a huge influence on our emotions. I would say, basically, you either like something or dislike. You either get annoyed with a sound or not. We also have the sounds which can soothe or ease your mood, but we have sounds which can easily agitate you. So I feel like there is no neutral sound, because if the sound becomes neutral, your hearing system just kind of turns it off. And this is because we just cannot monitor everything all the time. So some of the sounds are just like being selected. I can't think of specific example right now, but I would say that, for example, it's super crucial how we design the space, for example, housing. Mm-hmm. With all the materials, we want walls to be, let's say, sound resistant enough so that we don't hear the daily sounds of our neighbors who are just living. It's not like they have to be particularly noisy. Yeah. They're right. Just like, going on with their daily stuff. So I would start by saying that sound has a huge impact on our well-being, and this is a very complex conversation on how we make it work for the community, for all of us, which is also a matter of negotiating what sounds are included, what sounds are excluded.
Exactly. And especially when living in a city, we don't really have a choice on what sounds are included or excluded. I mean, just thinking about what you were saying a moment ago about the fact that we are constantly surrounded by a barrage of sound. I mean, on an average, let's say, day, do you know how many inputs or audio inputs we have to deal with?
It's not only about the biology, also in our culture, especially since the mid 20th century, I think we agreed that silence doesn't really exist. It's a very abstract concept. So what we can do is to navigate and, as I said, negotiate the position of people within the soundscape and make the sounds maybe work for our well-being a little bit better.
You mentioned soundscapes, so before we go any further, can you maybe explain to listeners what is a soundscape and maybe a few words about the man who kind of coined the term, Murray Schafer, right? And he was very kind of key in developing soundscape studies, right? So what is a soundscape?
So I use the word soundscape in a very general and broad term when I simply want to refer to the sounds around us. I use this as a synonym to, I don't know, audiosphere, phonosphere. I don't associate any particular theory to that. But it's true that the, let's say, founding father, the guy who made the term the most well-known is Murray Schafer.
He was Canadian, right?
Yeah, he was Canadian. Yeah. And for him, the idea of soundscape was strictly connected to ecology, or what we call the acoustic ecology. So it was very strictly connected to preserving the environment, the acoustic environment, and taking care of that. I must say that I kind of reject this theory. Because when you really, we don't want to get too academic maybe here, but when you really dig into his theory, you start to notice that he had a very, very specific image of the soundscape. He imagined soundscape like a musical composition with right and wrong sounds. So he basically was proposing what we are talking about here, the eviction of certain sounds. Mm-hmm. And the problem with the theory is who decides.
Yeah.
Because then you start to notice that the sounds he wanted to exclude are maybe very much biased with his, I don't know, race, nationality. So this becomes a little bit hard to maintain, especially nowadays, because the theory was coined like 50 years ago. So it's also a good moment to just re-examine and re-approach.
Reevaluate.
Yeah, reevaluate. Yeah. Being sort of in debt to this thought and having acknowledged the work he did, I kind of started to use the word soundscape in a very everyday way, as I said at the beginning, just to refer to the sounds around us. Full stop. Yeah.
Full stop. Exactly. But we've been talking for the past almost 10 minutes about sound and how sound affects us, how certain frequencies also can play with our well-being, make us feel better or make us feel worse. I'm actually wondering whether listeners to this podcast can actually list some sounds which maybe are good for they feel good with, and maybe list some sounds which you don't feel comfortable with, and then actually to kind of list them and then take a look at the end, what kind of sounds have a kind of positive connotation or negative connotation. Yeah.
This is actually a great exercise, because I would argue that most of us are not exactly aware of the soundscape around us. So this is a great exercise to just stop for a moment and, as you say, listen very attentively and start noticing the sounds around us and just making a very simple list. For example, you can set the alarm for 3 minutes, how much you can hear in 3 minutes. This exercise also shows us how many sounds there are around us, because during 3-minute listening, the list can become really extensive.
Yeah, I can
actually.
imagine.
So I also encourage our listeners to try this exercise, and maybe you can share your results with us then.
Yeah, exactly. That would be really interesting. Actually, it ties in with another exercise I sometimes do with students when I'm teaching audio recording, and that's just to sit in a park or sit somewhere and not necessarily make a list, but actually go one step further and try and make a sound map, right? Once you really concentrate on just the sense of hearing, you suddenly open up almost another world, right? With the amount of sounds that you can hear, because you're really fine-tuning your ear. And then you suddenly realize that, as you're quite rightly saying, the list really does kind of become extensive, yeah.
Yeah, the concept of a map is just brilliant because it's just another way the sound affects us. It's not only about emotions or how we feel positively or negatively, but sounds play a crucial role in the way we map the surroundings, because hearing is just connected to the attention, mechanisms in brain. It's connected to our balance, to the sense of balance.
Sure.
So we do use our ears to, for example, decide where is the source of the sound. Is it on the left? Is it on the right?
Yeah.
Is it in the back? Is it in the front? There's a lot of evolutionary, I would say, burden to this. So because you can determine whether the source of sound is big or small. So consequently, whether it's a threat or non-threat. So, for example, contrary to sight, sound is like the sphere. So you can map the full scale surroundings. And when there is a problem with a soundscape, for example, it's let's say too noisy, the frequencies are too mashed up, you can literally get dizzy. Or you can literally get some problems with vision, because this really confuses the brain. So sometimes people, for example, who are not used to going to concerts, they go to concert, and it's not just that it's too loud for them, it's disorienting.
Yeah.
So the sound and orientation, the sense of being in the world, is also very much connected.
You're giving examples of going to concerts, being in big cities, being in kind of urban conglomerations where we are constantly bombarded with sounds, all different kinds of sounds, from different sources and from all different directions. I wanted to take a step back and let's discuss silence now, right? The flip side, we're so used to sound. Are we even capable of enjoying silence nowadays? Are people even aware that silence exists? And surely what we sometimes think may be silent is anything but, right?
Yeah, I must say I have quite an ambiguous approach to silence, because first of all, I am noticing that we are kind of searching for silence. We are seeking silence.
It's like a luxury, right?
But and we are thinking that it's kind of a luxury. For example, notice you have the new buildings, the developers, investments popping around the city, and notice their names. They're like Silent Corner, like a Tranquil, whatever, right?
Yeah.
So the silence is being commodified, but I would like to emphasize that the silence as a commodity is really like 19th century idea.
Okay.
Honestly,
How?
I am quite positive about that, given the research I have done. 19th century is the moment where middle classes, and I mean like Victorian-ish European middle classes, start to use silence as a way to distinguish themselves from other social groups. For example, noisy workers. Like, we don't know whether workers were actually noisy and whatever that means. So you can take a look at the books which were meant for the domestic service. How should they behave in the house? There's a lot of silencing your body kind of advice. a lot of being quiet around and so on and so on.
There's also the Victorian term in terms of child raising, right?
Yes.
Children should be seen and not heard.
Absolutely. Yeah. This is about distinguishing the music listening areas in the city very strictly, coming up with the whole code of how you should behave while you listen to music. For example, you shouldn't talk while listening to music, which is not obvious given 17th century opera, which was basically like a huge party and people were eating, talking, and definitely not listening to what is going on the stage. So I want to say that it's very like historically, how do you say?
Bound? Or
yes, thank you. Historically bound. It's not a contemporary issue only. So the silence is being commodified.
And we see that nowadays as well, right?
As well, yeah.
Before coming in the studio, we mentioned two things, right? The first thing about this commodification is what we even see now in Poland, right? In Polish railways, strefa ciszy, so like the silent zone. And I'm sure a few train companies across the world have these, right? But what is it with the strefa ciszy? I personally use the silent zone because I like silence and I like my train rides also to be silent, yeah? But does this have some sort of social or class consequence?
I love the concept of silent zone in the Polish trains, and I have been thinking about recently that it should be 50-50. Like the half of the train is silent zone and the other half is non-silent, because currently you have like one carriage which
out of eight,
which is a silent zone, which makes it very special, which makes it very unusual. You need to have a reason to go there. Maybe it's because you're a busy business person and you have some important work to do. Maybe you are so busy with your life, you want to like chill, and it's not exactly in the marketing of the train company being seen, but it kind of gives off this vibe that it's like a special place for special people who
with special needs,
who appreciate the silence. And intentionally or not, this creates this kind of elite vibe around silence, which in reality is not always the case, just like normal carriage. Also recently I'm noticing the social contract around the silent zone in trains is diminishing and people are becoming more and more carefree. And this is not always
as in people not like doing, like not being silent in the silent zones.
Yeah, like talking on the phone or just like talking to each other.
Well, I'll show you actually an example on the complete flip side, which I witnessed in the silent zone in a Polish train very recently. And that was someone who picked up a telephone and immediately 3 passengers, completely unknown to this poor traveller with the phone in his hand, started berating him for actually picking up the phone in a silent carriage. Well, but it just goes to show that this social contract, right? It can go both ways. Either like, yeah, whatever, it's a silent carriage, but we don't really care, or we want to fight for this luxury. We want to be able to like sit in silence. So they immediately jumped on this poor passenger who then very swiftly went into the next carriage to continue his call. But it just goes to show, right, that people will fight for silence.
This is a very interesting example because we are taking this... I kind of feel we are taking this for granted. We take for granted the fact that the silence is an asset to fight for, and not the other way around. Like, imagine you go to Spain or you go to a society or the country which is culturally, we say...
louder, yeah.
Yes, how do you say stereotypically?
Stereotypically
louder. And you impose something like that on them. And they would be like, what is that? We don't use that. We don't need that.
But I think the quiet compartment concept would really work in Italy or Spain, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the question is, when have we decided that this silence is an asset to fight for? I'm asking this question because it's just not obvious. We kind of take it for granted. For example, why not speaking, community, I don't know, bonding, whatever. It's not like I am particularly extrovert person and I enjoy being silent and not talking to people, but it doesn't mean that this is very kind of philosophical way of thinking about this, because in philosophy you constantly ask these questions. What if? What if? What happens when we turn it around? And when I think about silence a lot, these are the questions that I just have. Like, when exactly, how did it happen that we would rather fight for silence than
Fight for
anything,
noise.
anything else?
And to continue on what you've been saying, and what has also been published on Holistic News for listeners who want to check the website, is that a number of cities across the world, such as New York, we have Knoxville in Tennessee, we have Amsterdam in Holland, they are now introducing sound cameras, right? So to try and drive out sound, and of course that's a nice pun actually because it's to do with road traffic, of course, sound out of these urban areas. Now, if you actually take a closer look at these areas where these systems have been introduced, we have the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea in London, which is the richest borough, well, one of, if not the richest district of London, bar Westminster probably. We have Amsterdam, which is an extremely affluent city, like this actual city of Amsterdam. And we have Manhattan. So obviously, like, people who live in Manhattan, they obviously, they have the money to, right? Enough said. How can society allow for these kinds of systems which punish people for making noise? And is it really possible to get people to stop making noise in public spaces?
This is such an amazing and astonishing idea, because I don't exactly know what is the reason behind installing the sound cameras. But for instance, if this is traffic noise, then why we don't regulate the traffic? Do you know what I mean? Like, why do you punish people instead of, for example, searching for the root of the problem? And once again, I was reading some 19th century publications written by like popular doctors, which were writing these popular books for people how they can just take care of their health on a daily basis. And with regard to noise and silences, there's not that much, but if there are any remarks, they are very often connected to the traffic noise. Because the paradox is that you should sleep in a well-ventilated room, which means you need to open the windows at night. But that also means that there is traffic noise because the lorries are still on, and this becomes kind of a very tense situation. And my question was, why do they advise individuals on how they should organize the bedroom so that the bed is, for example, away from window and so on? So in other words, the responsibility of the taking care of their sound well-being is imposed on the individuals rather than on a systemic change. In this case, regulating traffic at night. And this can, I think, translate to all the other systemic problems that we have, where the responsibility is imposed on individuals rather than, I don't know, big companies, governments who could take real action and make the neighborhoods more livable and just better for everyone. And coming back to the sound cameras, the idea of punishing other people for the way they behave acoustically is also very 19th century and, in my opinion, very dangerous. Because even if people who install and appeal for sound cameras don't say it explicitly, the question is, are they not biased in terms of social class, maybe in terms of gender, maybe in terms of
Race. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's extremely important to examine who is actually being affected by these regulations. Is this just a noisy neighbor who is just an asshole and misbehaves? Or maybe, and there's a huge risk for that, maybe it's the problem of, I don't know, white people versus black people. Maybe there are some like cultural tensions, immigrants versus non-immigrants, right?
When I'm thinking of the London example, so the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, I think the Royal kind of gives it away, yeah? It's a very affluent neighbourhood, and from what I've read, it's about people driving their fast cars too fast down the road. So instead of installing speed bumps, they've just decided to install these sound cameras. But I'm kind of thinking it is essentially an extremely classist thing. And I will go straight out and say that, because if you have a district of London which allows for such a pilot project, then why not also start it in, let's say, a diametrically different area of London and see what kind of results that would bring. And I'm thinking about Brixton, which is considered a very traditional black working class area of London. How is it that a city allows, one district to be silent and others they just don't care about?
Yes, that's a good question. Also, maybe it's necessary to say that noise pollution is a thing, just like light pollution. So a lot of work needs to be done to make it about the environment, which is in real threat, rather than making it about excluding certain communities for just like making a living in certain areas. And we are using a decibel as a sort of objective way to measure noise and sound because it's a number. And
people like numbers, yeah.
Yeah, and we think we can measure this. We have the device which shows us everything very specifically. It's a very imperfect.
Well, it's subjective for a start, yeah. Right? With decibels. Decibels are measurements of sound which are relative.
Yes, exactly.
So when you're dealing with anything to do with sound studies or any official reports which use decibels, you are basically looking at something which could be read and understood completely differently by different people, right?
That's my point. So what needs to be done is extensive studies, analysis of a certain area in the city to take action, because maybe there is, malfunctioning factory. Or maybe the way buildings are built is not sustainable enough and there is something wrong with the materials being used. They are just not soundproof enough and everybody is suffering. This needs to be studied long term. This is why sound cameras idea is so astonishing because, for example, in Poland, if you have, let's say, noisy neighbor, let's use this example.
Yeah, let's go for it.
You have a noisy neighbor, you can apply to, not even to police or anything like that, but to the hygiene institute. The person comes to your flat and they measure the decibels because that's what they use. But they measure the decibels over the course of some time. That means if your neighbor is incidentally noisy, you can't really punish them that much. The point of the complaint must be that they are continuously making a noise which prevents you from resting or maybe working or whatever. So my point is that the time, how long the noise issue is quite crucial. Just because once somebody was drilling holes on Saturday morning may not be enough for the complaint.
Especially that sound is ephemeral in its own, just the way it is there, right? You hear something now, I'm talking, and then I don't say anything, and we hear silence like now. But even then, you could probably hear something in the background, right? Yes. Through your headphones or through the speakers or wherever you're listening to this podcast. We can never really get away from sound. And do you think, actually, to wrap up this conversation, when we're thinking about silence, can we even deal with real silence? Have you ever been in an anechoic chamber like the one they have in Aguirre in
Yeah, I haven't. I would love to. However, I am
freaks people out apparently.
Yeah, it freaks people out because you start hearing your blood rushing through your veins. You start hearing high-pitched sounds, which is like your brain waves working. And this freaks you. You hear your breath, and this kind of freaks people out. So
you want to give it a go?
Yeah,
I want to give it a go too. I wonder if any listeners to this podcast have been in an anechoic chamber, and could you really deal with the extreme silence? I've always been fascinated by silence, and I'd love to live in, let's say, a quiet place. But when I think of a quiet place, it's never really silent, right? We always have the wind rushing through the trees, or some sort of romantic, I was going to say image, but some sort of romantic soundtrack, let's say, running in the back.
Yeah, this is my favorite definition I came up with about silence, that these are the sounds which are domesticated. So you choose which sound you want to have around you. You get used to them. They become kind of a transparent background for your everyday life. And you feel it's like silent, but maybe it's just a quiet ticking of your favorite clock. As you say, the nature sounds because you live in a place which is appeals to your needs. I feel we wouldn't know how to deal with absolute silence, and it's very curious to observe more and more articles and research about silence as something eerie, silence as something which makes you feel anxious, silence, for example, in the movies or also in literature, silence as something which makes you anticipate that something bad is going to happen. This helps us understand that silence is not necessarily a positive. It can mean something bad for us, and just makes the conversation more complicated and therefore more interesting.
Absolutely. So I'd like to thank Dr. Marta Michalska for coming on this episode of Holistic Podcasts. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you so much.
For more podcasts from Holistic, check the show notes to this episode and also be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. Thanks for listening.